In the archives of the Wehrmacht, buried beneath decades of dust and deliberate forgetting, there exists a peculiar pattern. A pattern that challenges everything we think we know about the Second World War. When German intelligence officers assessed their enemies on the Western Front, they created detailed profiles. They studied tactics, measured firepower, and calculated probabilities of survival. But there was one entry that stood apart from the cold mathematics of war. One entry that dripped with something the German military machine rarely acknowledged: pure, visceral dread. The entry was labeled simply, Kanadier. This wasn't about respect. The Germans respected many of their opponents. This was about fear. A specific, penetrating fear that caused veteran commanders to request transfers and hardened soldiers to falsify wounds rather than face them again. The question that has puzzled military historians for 8 decades is brutally simple. Why? Why did the most professionally trained army of the 20th century, an army that had conquered most of Europe, an army that fought the Soviets to a standstill in the East, fear the infantry from a nation of 10 million people across the Atlantic? Why did they fear the Canadians more than the Americans with their limitless resources, or the British with their centuries of military tradition? The answer isn't found in the propaganda films or the carefully edited memoirs of generals. It's found in the hastily scrawled field reports, in the interrogation transcripts of captured German officers, and in the psychological assessments conducted by Wehrmacht psychiatrists who noticed their soldiers breaking down at the mere mention of certain enemy units. This is not a story of heroism as Hollywood presents it. This is a story of calculated brutality, of men who learned to weaponize fear itself, and of a military culture that transformed volunteers from farms and factories into something that made professional killers hesitate. The doctrine of controlled savagery. The German soldier was trained to recognize patterns. His entire doctrine was built on reading the rhythm of battle, predicting enemy behavior, and exploiting weaknesses in that predictability. When the Wehrmacht faced the Americans, they quickly established a pattern. American units were methodical. They advanced with overwhelming support. If they encountered heavy resistance, they stopped, called for reinforcements, and waited for their artillery or air power to obliterate the obstacle. The German defender learned to dig deeper, disperse when the shells came, and return to position when the bombardment ceased. The American infantry rarely pressed attacks that cost too many casualties. Their commanders valued the lives of their men and had the luxury of material superiority to avoid needless bloodshed. Against the British, the pattern was different but equally predictable. British units fought with discipline and coordination. They advanced according to timetables set by their commanders. When they captured an objective, they consolidated immediately. They established defensive positions, brought up supplies, and prepared for the inevitable German counterattack. The British soldier was professional, steady, and reliable, but he was also conservative in his aggression. Field Marshal Montgomery's cautious approach to casualties meant that British attacks followed a recognizable template. The Germans could read the pattern and respond accordingly. But the Canadians shattered every pattern the Germans tried to establish. The first reports came from North Africa, from German officers observing the Dieppe raid in 1942. Despite the catastrophic failure of the operation, German intelligence noted something disturbing about the Canadian prisoners. They showed no signs of the psychological collapse typical of soldiers who had just endured a massacre. Instead, interrogators reported a disturbing hostility and a complete absence of defeat in their bearing. One report specifically noted that Canadian prisoners had to be separated from German guards after several violent incidents where unarmed Canadians attacked their captors. This was the first hint of what was to come. The Canadian approach to warfare was fundamentally different from their allies. Where the Americans brought overwhelming firepower and the British brought imperial steadiness, the Canadians brought something the Germans had only previously encountered on the Eastern Front: total commitment to violence. The Canadian doctrine, developed during their long training period in Britain, emphasized what they called aggressive defense and relentless pursuit. In practice, this meant that Canadian units were trained never to give the enemy time to recover. When they attacked until the objective was taken or every man was dead. When they defended, they counterattacked immediately, often before the German assault had even fully developed. German officers noted with alarm that Canadian units seemed to lack the self-preservation instinct that governed normal military behavior. A Wehrmacht assessment from Italy in 1943 stated, "The Canadian soldier does not withdraw when tactical logic suggests withdrawal. He does not pause when exhaustion suggests rest. He advances with a disregard for casualties that suggests either exceptional morale or exceptional indoctrination." What the Germans didn't understand was that it was neither. It was culture. The Canadian volunteers of World War II came from a nation still raw from the First World War. Their fathers and uncles had stories of Vimy Ridge, of Passchendaele, of being called shock troops by British commanders who used them to break the German lines. There was an inherited expectation that Canadians were the ones who finished what others couldn't. This wasn't propaganda imposed from above. This was a collective identity forged in the previous generation's blood. The Canadian soldier didn't need to be told to be aggressive. He carried it in his cultural DNA. The night belongs to the hunters. Darkness was supposed to bring respite. In the tactical manual of every army in World War II, nighttime was for consolidation, for bringing up supplies, for rotating exhausted men out of the line. Night attacks were considered exceptionally risky, prone to confusion, and generally avoided except in special circumstances by elite units. The German army, masters of combined arms warfare, followed this doctrine religiously. Their defensive positions were designed to maximize fields of fire during daylight. At night, they relied on sentries, flares, and the assumption that the enemy was as blind as they were. The Canadians turned night into a weapon. Beginning in Italy and perfected in Northwest Europe, Canadian infantry units developed a reputation for nocturnal violence that terrorized German defensive positions. This wasn't occasional raiding. This was systematic. German units facing Canadian sectors learned that darkness didn't mean safety. It meant the hunters were coming. The tactical advantage was obvious. Canadian units used the night to close the distance that made German machine guns and artillery so deadly during the day. They moved in small groups, often without radio communication, navigating by compass and moonlight. They struck German positions with grenades, submachine guns, and bayonets before the defenders could establish what was happening. By the time flares went up, the Canadians were already inside the German perimeter, and the fight had devolved into the kind of close-quarters chaos where training and aggression mattered more than firepower. But the psychological impact was even more devastating than the tactical success. German soldiers learned that they couldn't relax at night. Sleep deprivation became endemic in units facing Canadian sectors. Sentries became paranoid, firing at shadows and wasting ammunition on phantom threats. The constant stress of knowing that any moment could bring a knife out of the darkness broke men faster than daytime combat. Wehrmacht medical reports from Normandy noted unusual rates of combat fatigue and psychological breakdown in units that had been facing Canadian positions for extended periods. The reports specifically cited nocturnal anxiety and hypervigilance exhaustion. One captured German lieutenant from the 12th SS Panzer Division, interrogated after the Battle of Cannes, provided a chilling account. "We knew the Canadians were in front of us. Every night we waited. We heard them sometimes, moving in the darkness. Sometimes we heard nothing, and that was worse. My men stopped sleeping. They would lie in their positions with their eyes open, listening. Some of them began to crack. They would fire at nothing, scream that the Canadians were coming when there was no attack. When the actual attack came, we were already exhausted from days of waiting for it." The Canadians also mastered the art of weather warfare. While other Allied units waited for clear conditions to leverage their air superiority, Canadian infantry attacked during rainstorms, in fog, and through blizzards. The logic was ruthless. If the weather was bad for them, it was worse for the defender. German positions designed for maximum visibility became death traps when visibility dropped to meters. The Canadians used storms as cover, advancing through conditions that made conventional warfare impossible. The Battle of the Scheldt exemplified this approach. The terrain was already nightmarish. Flooded polders, dikes barely above water level, mud that could swallow vehicles whole. When other Allied units looked at the Scheldt, they saw impossibility. The Canadians saw opportunity. They attacked during the worst weather of autumn 1944, when rain turned the battlefield into a freezing swamp. German defenders, confident that no one would attack in such conditions, were caught completely unprepared when Canadian infantry emerged from the storm. The mathematics of merciless artillery. If the Canadian infantryman was feared in close combat, the Canadian artillery was feared from kilometers away. The German army, which prided itself on technical excellence and battlefield coordination, found itself consistently outmatched by Canadian gunners in a way they never experienced against American or British artillery. The difference wasn't in the guns themselves. All Allied forces used similar equipment. The difference was in how those guns were employed. Canadian artillery doctrine was inherited directly from the Canadian Corps of World War I, which had revolutionized artillery tactics at Vimy Ridge and become legendary for their accuracy and coordination. By World War II, this expertise had evolved into something approaching art. German intelligence reports repeatedly noted that Canadian artillery fire was unnaturally precise and responded with impossible speed to battlefield developments. What the Germans were experiencing was the result of years of specialized training and a tactical philosophy that integrated artillery not as support, but as the primary killing weapon of the army. The key was counter-battery fire. While American artillery focused on massing firepower and British artillery followed methodical fire plans, Canadian gunners hunted their German counterparts with obsessive efficiency. They used sound ranging, flash spotting, and aerial observation to locate German guns, then destroyed them before they could effectively support German infantry. A Wehrmacht artillery commander, captured during the Normandy campaign, stated in interrogation, "We could not keep our guns in position for more than a few hours. The Canadian artillery found us every time. We lost more guns to counter-battery fire against the Canadians than against any other enemy, including the Americans with their air spotting." But it was the creeping barrage that truly terrified German infantry. This World War I tactic had fallen out of favor with most armies because it required perfect timing and precision. If the artillery fired too far ahead, it was useless. If it fired too close, it killed your own men. The Canadians perfected it to the point where their infantry advanced just 30 to 50 meters behind exploding shells. For German defenders, this meant there was no gap between the artillery stopping and the infantry arriving. The moment the shelling lifted, Canadian soldiers were already in the trench. A German regimental combat report from the Hochwald Gap described the experience. The shelling was continuous and walked toward our positions with mechanical precision. We remained in our bunkers, waiting for the standard pause that would allow us to man our weapons. The pause never came. The shells stopped exploding directly on our position, and before we could react, the Canadian infantry was upon us. We had no time to establish defensive fire. They were in the trenches with grenades and automatic weapons while we were still emerging from cover. The psychological impact of this tactic cannot be overstated. German infantry learned that against Canadian artillery, there was no safe moment. They couldn't wait out the barrage because the barrage didn't end. It simply moved past them with the infantry right behind it. This created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that once Canadian artillery began firing, your position was already lost. It was simply a matter of time. Ortona and the death of urban warfare rules. December 1943. The Italian port town of Ortona. The German 1st Parachute Division, elite veterans of Crete and Monte Cassino, had turned the medieval town into a fortress. Narrow streets, thick-walled stone buildings, and strategic rubble barriers created a defender's paradise. British 8th Army commanders looked at Ortona and saw another Stalingrad in miniature. They recommended bypassing it. But the Canadians were ordered to take it, and what happened in those blood-soaked streets over 8 days in December rewrote the manual on urban combat. The Germans were prepared for conventional urban warfare. They had machine guns covering every street intersection, snipers in every bell tower, and infantry positioned to slaughter anyone foolish enough to advance along the roads. What they weren't prepared for was an enemy that refused to use the streets at all. The Canadians invented mouse-holing. Instead of advancing down streets, they would enter a building, clear it room by room, then blow a hole through the shared wall into the next building. They moved through Ortona building by building, never exposing themselves to the German-controlled streets below. It was claustrophobic, brutal work. Each room had to be cleared with grenades and submachine gun fire. There was no front line, no safe rear area. The battle existed in 3 dimensions, with combat happening simultaneously on multiple floors of adjacent buildings. For the German paratroopers, this was psychological torture. They were elite soldiers trained for mobile warfare and vertical assault. Instead, they found themselves trapped in an endless maze of exploding walls and close-quarters slaughter. A German officer who survived Ortona wrote, "We could hear them coming through the walls. We would position ourselves to defend a room, and they would blast through from a direction we hadn't anticipated. They used explosives with a recklessness that endangered themselves as much as us. Several times, Canadian soldiers were wounded by their own demolition charges, but they kept coming. The fighting in Ortona degraded into something primal. Men fought with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. The Canadians adapted to the environment with frightening speed, developing new tactics daily. They learned to throw grenades up stairwells without exposing themselves. They learned to use PIAT anti-tank weapons to blast through walls. They learned to fight in the dark because the constant explosions had destroyed the town's electrical system. The Germans called Ortona Little Stalingrad, but the comparison was misleading. In Stalingrad, both sides were locked in a death grip neither could escape. In Ortona, the Canadians were advancing. Slowly, at terrible cost, but advancing nonetheless. The German defenders realized with growing horror that their fortress was being conquered room by room, and there was nothing their training or tactics could do to stop it. By the time the last German paratrooper retreated from Ortona on December 28th, the 1st Parachute Division had been mauled by an enemy they couldn't predict or counter. The Canadians had suffered devastating casualties. 1 battalion was reduced to company strength, but they had won. More importantly, they had sent a message that reverberated through Wehrmacht intelligence reports for the rest of the war. The Canadians would take any objective, regardless of the cost, regardless of the tactical situation, and they would innovate whatever methods were necessary to achieve victory. The killing ground of Normandy and the SS. When the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division stormed Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, they faced the same German defenses that had turned Omaha Beach into a slaughterhouse. Bunkers, beach obstacles, interlocking fields of fire, and the elite defenders of the Atlantic Wall. By the end of D-Day, the Canadians had penetrated further inland than any other Allied force. But the real test wasn't the beach. It was what waited in the hedgerows beyond. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was waiting. Composed of fanatical teenagers led by hardened Eastern Front veterans, this unit embodied the worst of Nazi ideology combined with professional military skill. They were war crimes waiting to happen, and they didn't wait long. Within days of the invasion, Canadian prisoners were being executed. At the Abbaye d'Ardennes, SS officer Kurt Meyer oversaw the murder of surrendered Canadian soldiers. Word spread through Canadian units like wildfire. What followed was a spiral of violence that shocked even veteran observers. The Canadians stopped taking SS prisoners. This wasn't official policy, but it became unofficial practice. German intelligence intercepted Canadian radio communications that made their intentions clear. After particularly bitter fighting, 1 Canadian officer was heard saying, "No prisoners from the SS. They want a war without mercy. We'll give them one." The 12th SS, accustomed to terrorizing their opponents, found themselves facing an enemy that matched their fanaticism with cold fury. In the hedgerows around Caen, the fighting devolved into something medieval. Both sides fought with a personal hatred that transcended military objectives. The Germans realized, too late, that they had awakened something they couldn't control. The Canadians weren't fighting for ideology or conquest. They were fighting for revenge, and they were very, very good at it. The Battle of Verrières Ridge exemplified this brutal dynamic. The Canadian 2nd Infantry Division faced entrenched SS Panzer Grenadiers in a position that gave the Germans every advantage. The Canadians attacked 7 times. 7 times they were thrown back with horrific casualties. And 7 times they reformed and attacked again. By the end, German commanders were reporting that their own men were near collapse from the relentless pressure. One SS commander reported, "The Canadians do not stop. We break their attacks and they come again. We kill them and more come. Our men are asking how many Canadians there are, because surely no army can sustain these losses and continue attacking." But the Canadians did continue. They continued because surrender wasn't an option when facing the SS, and retreat wasn't in their doctrine. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy as an elite unit of over 20,000 men, was reduced to barely 300 combat-effective soldiers by the time the Canadians finished with them. German units began requesting transfer away from Canadian sectors. Some units, when faced with Canadian attacks, attempted to retreat toward American or British lines where they believed they would receive better treatment if captured. The fear became so pervasive that German commanders issued specific warnings about Canadian tactics and disposition. One such warning, captured in August 1944, stated, "Canadian infantry units display unusual aggression and disregard for casualties. They excel in night operations and close combat. Standard defensive tactics are insufficient. Recommend doubling normal defensive strength when facing Canadian sectors. Under no circumstances should isolated positions expect to hold against Canadian assault. Withdrawal to consolidated positions is preferable to encirclement." This was the Wehrmacht, the conquerors of Europe, recommending retreat rather than face the Canadians. The fear was complete.